I found out about her infidelity when it ended up in the hospital. Like so many people on this subreddit, I suddenly found myself a member of a club no one wants to join. I'll never forget the sound of my ex-sister-in-law's voice as she repeated, "I'm sorry," over and over on the phone as I rushed home from a week-long business trip. I was confused and had absolutely no idea what she meant, but only after managing to calm her down a bit did she inform me that my wife was in the hospital and I needed to hurry home. My mind raced as I tried to gather more information while speeding to get there faster. All she told me was that it was an assault, and then she hung up and didn't respond when I tried to call her back. Some background. My ex and I met when we were about 25 years old. It was through a mutual friend at a barbecue. At first, she seemed almost too good to be true. Not only was she incredibly beautiful, but also shy and introverted. It took a while for us to officially start dating, but once we did, I was over the moon. When we tried to be intimate for the first time, she suddenly started crying. I should have taken it as a bad sign, but I got scared and thought it was something I had done. But she apologized the next day and told me she was affected. It turns out that 2 years before meeting me, she was in a long-term relationship with a guy who was emotionally, physically, and mentally abusive. She was still in therapy, so we decided to take things slowly. It was tough, but because I loved her, I believed we would get through this and strengthen our relationship. Another year passed, and we got engaged. The first time intimacy happened at this stage, I was fortunate enough to be able to buy a house for us, courtesy of my late uncle's inheritance. Things were going really well, and she semi-seriously suggested that we plant a peach tree, which was important to her for later symbolism of new beginnings. And she loved it. We got married shortly after, and frankly, it was absolutely amazing. Of course, we had our normal ups and downs like any married couple, but we considered ourselves luckier because she always made sure we didn't go to bed angry at each other, and always gently pointed out if I did something that bothered her. At some point, life just happened, and I got promoted at work, which meant more money but also meant I would travel more for work conferences and meetings. I noticed she was getting depressed more often and wasn't as intimate as before. She kept her phone close to her and even stopped gently addressing things that bothered her. I tried to talk to her about it, but she assured me it was fine and that it was just a phase she was going through, and there was no reason not to trust her. Sometimes she would go to her sister's house and spend the night, telling me she just needed some time with her sister. The day I received that fateful phone call was the day she was supposed to be accompanying her sister again. I remember rushing to the hospital, barely breathing, and frantically asking for my wife. The most understanding and patient police officer in the world made me sit down to explain what had happened. He said he was a friend of my sister-in-law and had responded to a domestic disturbance call. He arrived and found the couple fighting. Supposedly, the boyfriend was on top of the woman, hitting her, and she was screaming and trying to scratch. This made no sense to me because 1, it had nothing to do with my wife since we were married, and 2, literally everyone who knew my wife knew she wouldn't do that. He looked at me wisely and put his hand on my shoulder. Then he told me to be very calm because the supposed girlfriend was actually my wife. If it hadn't been for the seriousness of the situation, I would have laughed in his face, but something about the way he said it made me believe him. Then a nurse led me to see my wife, and what greeted me until today I can barely find the words to describe. I just stood there for what felt like an eternity, and then a doctor came and explained her injuries. Her jaw was slightly fractured, her left eye was completely swollen shut, and she had massive bruises covering half of her face, as well as 3 broken ribs. Then the doctor dropped another bombshell. She was pregnant. I still couldn't understand how it happened, but then I saw her sister. At first, she tried to avoid contact with me, but persuaded by her police friend, she told me what she knew. It turns out my wife's ex had contacted her 5 months earlier. He was doing this thing of redeeming himself and apologizing to people he had harmed to cleanse his karma. Someone else is detecting a nonsense alert at this point. They started talking more, and then he convinced her to meet for coffee and show her that he was a changed man. Obviously, old feelings resurfaced along with the fact that he seemed different now, and it soon turned into an emotional affair. My wife turned to her sister for advice, who told her to take it slow and just get him out of her system if necessary, which eventually led to a physical affair. A few months later, he told my wife that she should at least make amends with her ex somehow, and offered to cover for her occasionally. My sister-in-law was crying at this point and apologized to me over and over, saying she didn't know anything about the abuse because my wife never told anyone except me and her therapist. At that moment, I was numb. I just couldn't feel anything, and I was absolutely amazed by my wife's actions. When my wife finally woke up, I was there, and she broke down crying when she saw me. I spent the following months in zombie mode. She received individual therapy, and we had couples therapy with strong insistence from her family on therapy. Surprisingly, she was honest about how everything happened and how she absolutely hated herself for causing me pain. She mentioned that at one point on her way to her ex's house, she actually fantasized about driving into the river because it smelled like him, and she didn't want his smell to corrupt me. The end of everything. But she was too weak, and only after finding out she was pregnant did she really wake up and realize that any further contact with that man was toxic not only for her, but also for the unborn child. So she went to end it in person forever. When he became aggressive with her, she became a shadow of herself and developed a phobia of other men except me. At one point, she couldn't even go to the bathroom at night unless I held her hand. Sad but true. After the baby was born, a boy by the way, we did a paternity test, and it turned out to be mine. But the more time I spent with her, the more I realized that I didn't hate my wife. I actually despised her. I couldn't see the woman I married. Instead, I saw the remnants of her past every time I looked at her. I decided to leave because I was afraid of doing something I would regret and would be exactly like her.